So now let me introduce Robin Dodson, and in particular introduce the Silent Spring Institute where she works. Robin is a research scientist there and has her doctorate from Harvard School of Public Health. And she oversees the Institute's current consumer product exposure research. So she's going to talk about exposure assessment. I'm glad that Jim made the distinction between rates and risks, because I think a lot of what Robin and certainly the next speaker in this panel will talk about, you keep those distinctions in mind. Risk is a sort of projection based on either animal models or structure activity relationships that some chemists can come up with, whereas often epidemiologists talk about rate differences or rate ratios, or actually Shana will talk about hazard ratios, which are really based on human counts and human rates of disease. So let me just lastly say that one of the things that I was impressed about with Silent Spring Institute's work was their ability to identify hazardous chemicals in everyday products. And my favorite actually was before Robin started working at Silent Spring Institute, they were doing a household survey and found that there were high levels of PCBs in polychlorinated biphenyls in some people's houses. And they asked the participants of this survey what that might come from. And somebody mentioned that their floor wax was called Fabulon. And so that's what actually was the source of the PCBs. Some floor wax used to have it in it and was put on people's floors. So that's the kind of creative use of survey research methods and survey data that Robin and her colleagues at Silent Spring Institute are famous for.
Thank you. Thank you all for sticking in there. So yes, my name is Robin Dodson. I'm an exposure scientist with Silent Spring Institute. And I'm going to be talking about scientific uncertainty and safer solutions, and particularly thinking about cancer risks that are associated with consumer products, or products that we depend on every day. So when we think about pollution, we often think about it out there, right? The idea is that there's some smokestack spewing some nasty chemicals into the air, or maybe being discharged into our water system. But I want to contend, and I do contend, that pollution is actually very personal. Pollution is not just out there. It's also in our homes. It's in our bodies. It's in our children's bodies. And that we need to kind of reframe how we think about how we're exposed to environmental pollutants. And this is because there are over 80,000 chemicals in US commerce. So Dr. Kripke has already given away my kind of slide here, but the idea is that there are 80,000 chemicals in US commerce, and a very, very small fraction, maybe less than 10%, have actually comprehensively been evaluated for safety before those chemicals are put into the products. That is because of how we regulate chemicals in this country. But the result is that when you go and buy a product, nobody is necessarily minding the store, right? That unfortunately, we can pick up a product on a shelf that has chemicals in it that are associated with cancer. Now, I want to talk about what I mean by chemicals that are associated with cancer. And this was actually just brought up, this idea of what is actually causing cancer, or what is associated with cancer. Now, at Silent Spring Institute, we focus on the environment and women's health with a particular focus on breast cancer. So we look at the biology, or the laboratory evidence that thinks about chemicals that might be reasonably associated or plausibly linked from a biological perspective with the development of breast cancer. So to narrow down those 80,000 chemicals in US commerce, to try to identify and to prioritize those chemicals, we focus on chemicals that damage DNA. These are kind of like your classic carcinogens, right? But we also focus on chemicals that might act as hormone disruptors. That's because we know that if you take a breast cancer cell in the lab and you expose it to estrogen, that breast cancer cell will grow. So any chemical that might act like estrogen also potentially could influence or promote tumor growth. We also look at chemicals based on laboratory evidence that are shown to be hormone disruptors that alter our development in some way. From a breast cancer perspective, we think about this as altering, say, mammary gland development at a very early age, because that can increase your susceptibility later in life. So we use these kind of biological examples to help us narrow down the chemicals, or prioritize the chemicals that we want to think about. Because we have to kind of start somewhere, right? So back in the President's Cancer Panel, They actually challenged the research community to come up with a new paradigm for thinking about the role of the environment in the development of cancer. You see, breast cancer and other cancers are long latency disease. Breast cancer can take decades to develop. And so our traditional models of trying to identify and associate chemical exposures to the disease later in life is quite difficult. We can't necessarily take that traditional epidemiological approach. We're going to dose somebody at a known concentration at some point, and then we're going to wait and see if the cancer develops. Instead, we need to come up with a new paradigm for thinking about what evidence we have at hand to then take some sort of action, to do something and prevent cancer. So we combine evidence of what we know about the biological mechanism. That means we look to the laboratory evidence to understand which chemicals might plausibly be linked to cancer, and combine that with what we know about human exposure to those chemicals. Now, I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the idea is that what we're doing here is that we are combining lines of evidence. We are not trying to prove anything. In fact, that bar of proof is probably impossible when we're thinking about cancer prevention of long latency diseases, right? We are not talking about X, chemical X has proven to cause disease Y. Rather, we're thinking about this as a weight of evidence. The idea is that there is a plausibility of it being biologically associated with cancer. We know that we're exposed, and that alone should be our basis for action. That action could be because we're going to work on education, regulation, or reformulation. So now I want to talk about the exposure side of this. In part because that's what I am, an exposure scientist, but also because that's where I think there's lots of opportunities for prevention, and that's because we could try to reduce our exposure to prevent this disease. So hormone disruptors are in the products that we use every day. We know this because I tested them. I tested over 200 products that we use every day for about 60 hormone disrupting chemicals. We published our findings in Environmental Health Perspectives in 2012. And we know that we're exposed, that our products that we used every day contain things like phthalates, contain things like parabens, which are preservatives. We also know, and I apologize, there's just a weird animation going on in the slide. Okay. We also know that the chemicals in the products don't stay put. They get out of the products and they enter into our homes. They get into the air that we breathe. They also get into our house dust. House dust is an amazing place to look for chemical exposures inside the home. And who knew I needed to get a doctorate to do a whole lot of vacuuming of people's homes? But it's true. I do a whole lot of vacuuming. And when I look into people's homes, in fact, this is actually a result of a meta-analysis that we did where we looked at household exposure studies from across the country, including many of Silent Spring studies. When we look at them together, we see that phthalates, for example, are found in 100% of homes. I've never gone into a home, and I've tested hundreds of homes, and not found phthalates in people's homes. Phthalates are used as plasticizers, but they're also used in personal care products. Basically, they're really good at holding fragrances to make that scent last all day. But we also find things like flame retardant chemicals in people's homes, including carcinogenic chlorinated tris, which we pulled out of babies' pajamas because of the concerns of cancer in the late 1970s, but we actually never regulated it in terms of putting it into our couches. So it is definitely used in other ways in our home. These chemicals don't just stay in our homes. They go from the products into our homes and into our bodies. And when we look at CDC's national biomonitoring data, this is from their NHANES data. This is nationally representative data. And we look at a suite of common consumer product chemicals. We see that chemicals like parabens, again, those are the preservatives that actually in laboratory studies act as estrogenic. They act like estrogen in lab studies. We see that they're found in nearly 100% of Americans. But not everyone is exposed equally. In fact, that we can see that non-Hispanic blacks have higher levels of methylparaben in their bodies compared to other women or other people. And this could be because of unique sources of these chemicals. We did a product testing study published this last year where we looked at hormone disrupting chemicals in hair products commonly used by black women. And we found methylparaben to be very common in these products that are commonly used by Black women. And many of these chemicals, like paraben, were found at higher levels than the equivalent products used by other women. So there's a disparity issue here. Now, I mentioned CDC's National Biomonitoring Program, which is meant to be nationally representative. We at Silent Spring have a program that is a crowdsourced biomonitoring program. It's crowdsourced, meaning that people can enroll themselves in a biomonitoring program. CDC, you have to be randomly selected or probability weighted selected to be involved. In our program, you can enroll yourself to be biomonitored. In addition to collecting a urine sample, we also ask questions about your behaviors, about the products that you use. And then we also report back your results to you. Again, a difference with the CDC's National Biomonitoring Program. And from this Detox Me Action Kit program, which we have over 800 people enrolled right now, which, as I managed this project, we had originally thought we'd get like 150. This has become a much bigger project, thankfully, than we originally thought. But it's become an amazing kind of area for research for us. An early finding out of this is that we can see, and this should be of no surprise, that the more products that you use, the higher your concentrations of, and again, I'm showing for methylparaben, but this is true for other chemicals, the more products that you use, the higher your concentrations that we can find in your body. So products contain chemicals of concern that are associated with cancer. These chemicals in the products that we use get into our homes and they get into our body. Now, I've been talking about things like phthalates and parabens, but another class of chemicals that have been getting a lot of attention recently are these perfluorinated chemicals, PFAS, highly fluorinated chemicals. They've got lots of different names. The forever chemicals. These are the most persistent chemicals. There are kind of half-lives. How long we think they stick around in the environment is on the order of decades, if not longer. They are commonly used in household products, including things that often get stain-resistant treatment or water-resistant treatment, and also things like non-stick pans. They are found because they are used as grease-proof paper when you get takeout and things like that. They are found in fast food packaging. And actually, my colleague at Silent Spring did this study looking at total fluorine in fast food packaging wrappers and found that, for example, in dessert and bread wrappers, over half of them had these perfluorinated chemicals. Perfluorinated chemicals are a very diverse class of chemicals. They're probably maybe up to, the number keeps going, it's about 4,800 different individual chemicals make up this class. So it's very complex. That's why we're looking at total fluorine content here. But the good news in part because of this work is that actually Washington State has banned PFAS in fast food packaging. In others, there's been other movements to try to do that in other places around the country. In a very recent study that just came out, we also correlated the concentrations measured of PFAS in women and certain behaviors, and found an association between the use of Glide floss and other Glide-like floss, basically Teflon, and the use of Glide floss, the use of or presence of stain-resistant carpets and furniture treatments in homes, as well as eating out of coated cardboard, in other words, eating more takeout, was associated with higher levels of PFAS chemicals in the body. Also associated, and this is where you've probably heard about this group of chemicals, is that if you are in a water system that is served, that's been contaminated by PFAS, you had higher levels. So I want to talk about trying to reduce our exposure. So I get to play detective as an exposure scientist, and I get to not only figure out what the exposures might be, but also then try to figure out the best way to reduce our exposures. The first level of that I want to focus on is actually at the consumer level. And that's not because I think all the action just happens at the consumer level, but because we've created an app. Often I give a talk about, oh, these chemicals are everywhere, you're exposed every day, and then the number one thing is, what can I do about it? Well, what we've done is in an app, a free app, we've actually aggregated all of our evidence-based tips into an app. It's a Healthy Homes app that is not meant to tell you which product to buy, but rather when you're making decisions about your home or product choices, that you can make informed decisions. Some of the top tips related to what I've already been talking about is to look for things that are paraben-free, phthalate-free, and fragrance-free. Look at the product label. Avoid vinyl in your home. Vinyl contains percentage levels, like 25% phthalates in vinyl, so avoiding vinyl when possible. Eat more fresh food instead of packaging. There's a host of reasons to do this anyways, but avoiding packaged food will reduce your exposure to phthalates, bisphenols, as well as perfluorinated chemicals. Keep dust levels low. We know that these chemicals like to hang out in dust. So if you reduce your exposure to dust itself, you'll reduce your exposure to these chemicals. And steer clear of things that are advertised as stain-resistant or antimicrobial, to avoid things like PFAS and to avoid things like triclosan, which is a thyroid disruptor. So let's talk about example at another level, both at the consumer and the institutional level, about where you can take some action. This comes out of a study I conducted a couple of years ago called the Move-In Study. This Move-In Study, we basically measured indoor air in people's newly renovated subsidized housing in Boston before people moved in and then after they moved in, with the idea to disaggregate or separate what did the people bring in to their home exposures and what was there because of the building material, the building itself. This is important because those chemicals that are associated with the occupant, you could focus on education programs with the occupant. You could work with the occupant to make more informed decisions. Recall this was actually done in a green renovated space, so we could say you're greening the occupant here, not necessarily the building. Not surprising, we found things like synthetic fragrances. This is going from pre to post-occupancy sample levels. You can see that the levels increase when people move in. Not surprising. They're bringing in synthetic fragrances. These two fragrances, at least in laboratory studies, again, act as estrogenic, or act like estrogen. Something like triclosan, it's the antibacterial, is pretty much brought in by the occupant. That's not a surprise. But also something like PBDE, which is a flame retardant. This is actually a phased-out flame retardant. It was phased out 10 years before we did this study. But we found it in people's homes because it's a highly persistent chemical that's still in people's couches. You don't get rid of your couch immediately. When something is phased out, it doesn't, you snap your finger and it goes away. It's still in that couch, and it will be for many years. And so this is likely because people are bringing in the sources into their home, say older couches. Now, for those chemicals that are actually influenced by the building itself, meaning that they are used in the building materials, used in the renovation process, the exposure reduction happens at a different level. It happens at the architect level, the material specifier level. Maybe this was done in Boston Housing Authority. Maybe it happens at the Housing Authority level. Or maybe it happens at the Green Building Standard level. So things like toluene and xylene, these are VOCs that are pretty much captured in regulations, including the Green Building Standards. And not surprisingly, I should say, they were present in the building. But something like benzophenone, this is a chemical that we typically, before I did this study, I would have said we're going to find this increase with occupancy. And that's because it's a UV filter commonly added to personal care products. It's also a UV filter that can be added to things like paints to protect the paint from UV. And so this was a surprise to us. And what this means is that we need to think more broadly about the chemicals and how they're used in, say, building materials. This is not just the only example. There's a couple phthalates that did this too. I would have thought that they were going to be in personal care products, but we find them in building materials as well. So now we want to give, and moving kind of further out here in the exposure reduction, is talk about an example of where we could take action at the retailer or the manufacturing level. This comes out of our research on flame retardant chemicals. In 2005, Chemtura phased out penta-BDE, which was the most commonly used flame retardant added to couches at the time. They phased it out and did a direct replacement with a chemical mixture called Firemaster 550. When we look at dust concentrations measured in homes near the ban or near the phase out rather, and then subsequent to that, 5 years later, we find that those PBDE levels do go down. That's the good news. There's an influence. The phase out did reduce levels. The bad news is a regrettable substitution that's happening over on the right. That FireMaster 550, that's the replacement. Those levels went up. And unfortunately, we were using FireMaster 550. I should say, society, Chemtura, was putting FireMaster 550 in the couches before it was fully vetted for safety. So now we're getting the health studies that are telling us about how bad FireMaster 550 really is. So moving further out, I want to give an example at the regulatory level, and again, looking to our flame retardant work. In our California household exposure study conducted in 2006, we found much higher levels of flame retardants in house dust in California compared to the rest of the country, and also in Californians themselves in their blood. And this is because of a unique furniture flammability standard that was on the books in California at the time. But a result of our work, as well as a result of work by activists, as well as a group that actually was quite vocal, were also firefighters, there was a change in the flammability standards in California. And the result is that now we can buy couches and other furnishings, baby products, without flame retardant chemicals in them. You just have to look for the label. So this shifted not only the regulations, but also the market, which was really important. Another example of where standards are influencing exposure, or regulations are influencing exposure, this is comparing dust concentrations measured actually in college dorms. So not only do I get to vacuum people's homes, but I get to vacuum college dorm rooms. This is comparing dorm rooms on a campus that adhere to a much more severe flammability standard compared to one that less severe standard. With the hypothesis, to meet that standard, you'd have to add more flame retardant chemicals. Okay, so it's the regulation that is driving the use of these chemicals. And we can see significantly higher levels of these chemicals on that campus with more severe standard. This is part of a program that we have at Silent Spring that I lead called the Healthy Green Campus Initiative, where we're working with higher ed to really actually leverage their purchasing power as an institution to move away from purchasing things like flame retardants and couches. We're doing this for flame retardants and also things like perfluorinated chemicals. We're doing this in higher ed, but there are examples in healthcare where this has been happening with, say, healthcare without harm's work. But really leveraging those institutions and their purchasing power could be quite effective in reducing exposures. I also want to quickly touch back on talking about PFAS chemicals again, because this is such a hot topic. It's estimated that 16 million Americans and maybe even up to 110 million Americans have detectable levels of PFAS in their drinking water. EPA has set some health advisory levels, and actually there's a headline today saying that they are not going to establish them as regulatory levels, but merely guidance levels, which means they will not be enforceable. But EPA has set some advisory levels in drinking water that at 70 parts per trillion. But what's happening is actually states are stepping up and realizing that that level, that action level, is actually too high and setting their own standards much lower. This is where the regulatory action is happening. It's actually at the state level. And here in Pennsylvania, I understand that the governor signed an executive order to establish a PFAS task force to look at this, to look at PFAS contamination in Pennsylvania and think about establishing guidelines here. So I talked about kind of scaling action, scaling exposure reduction along different levels here, with the idea is that we shouldn't rest it all in one person's lap necessarily, right? That yes, the consumers can do something. There are things you can do when you go to the store tomorrow. You can make informed decisions. You can get involved in consumer campaigns. But this actually can also happen at the institutional level around purchasing specifications, things like material specifications when we're renovating homes, or purchasing specifications when we're buying furniture for colleges. It can also happen at the retail space, at the retailer or the manufacturer space. Things like phasing out chemicals, phasing out PBDE flame retardants. Also through campaigns like the Mind the Store campaign, which has been targeting retailers like Walmart and Home Depot to have them address the chemicals in the products that they put on their shelves. And there are some retailers that are seeing this as a market advantage. and moving into that space to create healthier, safer products. And at the regulatory level, there are things like changing standards that we know can influence exposure. We saw this in the flame retardant example. This will likely come up in the fluorinated chemicals as well, the PFAS example. The idea is that we can move those standards to try to reduce risks. But I also want to pause and say this is also the time, particularly for PFAS, where we need to take more of a class-based approach to avoid that problem that I showed with flame retardant chemicals, where one goes down but the other goes up. We don't want to do that with PFAS chemicals. So in the regulatory space, thinking about more of a class-based approach will help us avoid that in the future. There are many other examples of where that's kind of been a regrettable substitution. So I was asked to identify some recommendations at the research, policy, and clinical levels. In the research space, I think we need to identify drivers of exposure disparities. We know exposure disparities exist, and we need to identify why they exist, because that's where we can make real steps towards preventing disease, especially among those that might be most vulnerable. We also need to test our exposure reduction to demonstrate that it works. At the policy level, we need to engage in the public comment process. What I mean by that is that there's opportunities, like last week where EPA had an open public comment on their assessment of Gen X, which is a PFAS chemical. Everybody needs to get involved in that. As researchers, we need to get involved in that, but also as activists and advocates, getting involved in that process. And also supporting things like class-based approaches to avoid regrettable substitutions. At the clinical and public health level, I think we need to expand, or include rather, environmental risk factors in cancer prevention plans. We heard this earlier about physicians not necessarily, or clinicians not necessarily kind of acknowledging the importance of the environment in disease, and particularly in cancer. So supporting physicians and supporting clinicians in that, in their acknowledgement of the importance of the environment. And also communicating uncertainty. Communicating uncertainty in a way that most effectively talks about what we do and what we don't know. We don't need to talk about uncertainty and think about raising the bar so high that we need to prove X cause Y. Rather, the idea is that we can talk about, hey, there just hasn't been any research on that. It doesn't mean that X isn't related to Y. It's just there hasn't been research yet. So moving away from things like that, there's no proof, but rather we need to develop the evidence. So with that, I just want to, if you want any of our resources or read any of our research papers, direct you to our website, and welcome questions during the question and answer period.